cockpit was calm, a quiet hum of machinery blending with the muffled chatter of passengers in the cabin. Captain David Grant adjusted his headset, his experienced hands navigating the controls of Flight 19, a routine commercial flight bound for its destination. Beside him, First Officer Elena Torres reviewed the flight plan, her sharp eyes scanning the instrument panel. The altitude was steady, the engines purred with precision, and the weather was clear. A perfect day for flying. Suddenly, the tranquility was broken. A sharp beep pierced the calm, followed by the ominous flash of a warning light on the control panel. "Master caution," Elena announced, her voice tight but controlled. David leaned forward, his brow furrowing as he studied the display. The warning indicated a potential problem with one of the engines. Before they could delve deeper, turbulence jolted the plane, sending a ripple of unease through the cabin. The seatbelt sign dinged on, and the captain's steady voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've encountered some unexpected turbulence. Please remain seated and fasten your seatbelts." In the cabin, flight attendants exchanged nervous glances. Lead attendant Sarah Mills moved swiftly, securing trays and ensuring passengers were buckled in. Her years of experience told her that something wasn't right, but she maintained a calm demeanor, her reassuring smile masking her concern. Back in the cockpit, the situation escalated. The warning light multiplied into a cascade of alerts. "Oil pressure in engine 2 is dropping," Elena reported, her fingers flying across the controls. David's voice remained calm, but there was a steel edge to it now. "Run the checklist. Let's confirm if it's a sensor fault or something more serious." The plane hit another violent pocket of turbulence, this time accompanied by a faint but distinct shudder from the right engine. Elena's stomach tightened. "We might be looking at an engine failure, Captain." David nodded, his mind racing through the possibilities. "Let's contact air traffic control." The radio crackled to life. "Mayday, mayday, mayday. This is Flight 19. We are experiencing engine issues and require immediate assistance." A tense voice responded from ground control. "Flight 19, this is Houston Center. Copy your mayday. What's your current situation?" Elena relayed the details as David worked to stabilize the aircraft. The tension in the cockpit was palpable, every second feeling like an eternity. Outside the plane, ominous storm clouds loomed on the horizon, unexpected and unaccounted for. The once clear skies had turned threatening, and the aircraft's path was leading straight into their heart. The cabin grew quiet, passengers exchanging worried glances as the turbulence worsened. Sarah moved through the aisles, her calm demeanor now tinged with urgency. A child clung to their mother, eyes wide with fear. An elderly man gripped his armrest, murmuring a quiet prayer. Back in the cockpit, the critical question hung in the air. Will they be able to get the plane safely on the ground? The crew's years of training would be tested like never before, and every decision from this moment forward would carry the weight of 200 lives. The atmosphere in the cockpit of Flight 19 was a blend of professionalism and camaraderie, as Captain David Grant and First Officer Elena Torres worked seamlessly through the pre-flight checklist. David, a seasoned pilot with 20 years of experience, was known among his peers for his calm demeanor under pressure. His reputation as a pilot's pilot had been earned through countless hours in the air and a few near misses that tested his mettle. Elena, on the other hand, was relatively new to the captain's right seat. A rising star in the airline, she was meticulous and sharp, with a background in aeronautical engineering. Her quick thinking and analytical approach often complemented David's steady hand. The two had flown together on a handful of occasions, but this flight was their first long-haul journey as a team. In the cabin, lead flight attendant Sarah Mills moved effortlessly through her pre-flight duties. With over a decade of experience, Sarah had seen it all: crying babies, unruly passengers, and mid-air medical emergencies. Her role was as much about managing people as it was ensuring safety. Her team included Maya, a cheerful and empathetic attendant on her third international flight, and Jake, a no-nonsense veteran known for his dry humor. Flight 19 was en route from Denver to Miami, a routine domestic flight that crossed over the unpredictable weather patterns of the Midwest. As the plane climbed to cruising altitude, The skies were clear, the sun casting a golden hue over a sea of white clouds. Passengers settled into their seats, flipping through in-flight magazines, adjusting headphones, or nodding off for a nap. The flight plan was straightforward, but the crew had noted a low-pressure system forming along their route during the morning briefing. It wasn't uncommon for such systems to cause minor turbulence, and they had planned accordingly. Yet as they approached the outskirts of the system, Elena noticed something unsettling. It began subtly, a faint vibration in the controls, almost imperceptible, but enough to catch Elena's attention. She glanced at David, who raised an eyebrow in silent acknowledgement. "It's probably just a gust," David said, his voice calm. "Let's keep an eye on it." Minutes later, the vibration returned, this time accompanied by a flicker on the engine monitoring system. Elena frowned, leaning closer to the screen. "Engine 2 pressure fluctuation," she reported. "It's minor, but it's there." David nodded, his hands steady on the yoke. "Run diagnostics. Let's see if it's a sensor issue or something mechanical." In the cabin, the passengers remained blissfully unaware of the slight shift in the crew's focus. Sarah continued her rounds, chatting with a nervous flyer in row 12 and helping a couple stow their oversized bag. Back in the cockpit, the situation escalated. The flicker turned into a persistent warning light, and the vibration grew more pronounced. "Oil pressure is dropping on engine 2, Elena said, her tone edged with concern. "Not catastrophic yet, but we need to act." David's mind raced through the possibilities. "Let's follow the protocol. Reduce load on engine 2 and monitor." Elena complied, her movements precise as she adjusted the settings. But as she did, the cockpit jolted violently, and the shuddering intensified. The turbulence was no longer a minor inconvenience. Passengers were gripping their armrests, and the plane's cabin creaked under the strain. Sarah and her team moved quickly to reassure passengers, their calm tones masking the growing tension. In the cockpit, the warning lights multiplied. "We're losing power on engine 2, Elena said, her voice clipped. "It's not responding to the throttle adjustment." David's jaw tightened. "We need to shut it down before it causes more damage. Prepare for single-engine operation." Elena hesitated for a fraction of a second, the weight of the decision visible in her eyes. Shutting down an engine mid-flight was a rare and serious move, but the data left no room for doubt. As she initiated the procedure, another warning blared, this time for engine 1. "No way," Elena muttered, her hands flying across the controls. "Engine 1 is overheating. This can't be a coincidence." David's mind raced. Dual engine failures were almost unheard of in modern aviation, and the odds of such a scenario were astronomically low. Yet here they were, facing what no amount of training could fully prepare them for. Outside, the low-pressure system had evolved into a full-blown storm, its dark clouds now enveloping the aircraft. Lightning flashed in the distance, illuminating the towering cumulonimbus formations. David glanced at Elena. "We're in for a rough ride. Let's reroute and aim for the nearest airport." But as Elena checked the navigation system, her face fell. "We've lost GPS," she said, "and comms are intermittent. This storm is messing with everything." In the cabin, the mood had shifted from mild unease to outright fear. The once chatty passengers were now silent, their faces pale as the plane jolted and swayed. Sarah's voice came over the intercom, steady but firm. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. We're experiencing some unexpected turbulence, but the crew is handling it. Thank you for your cooperation." Inwardly, she prayed that her words were true. The cockpit erupted in chaos, a symphony of blaring alarms and flashing red lights that painted the confined space in an ominous glow. Every warning indicator on the control panel screamed danger, each demanding attention like a frantic cry for help. Captain David's hands moved instinctively over the controls, his knuckles white as he fought to maintain control. First Officer Elena's voice cut through the noise, sharp and focused. "Engine 1 is failing. Thrust is dropping. Altitude decreasing rapidly." David darted a glance at the altimeter, watching the needle plummet like a stone. His grip on the yoke tightened. "We stabilize or we don't make it." "Hold on," he barked, his voice steady but tense. The aircraft jolted violently, tossing them against their restraints. Overhead compartments rattled, and the sound of strained metal groaned against the storm outside. Engine 2 is out! Elena's voice rose. It's gone! No restart! For a brief moment, silence enveloped the cockpit, broken only by the shrill wail of the master alarm. David's jaw clenched, his mind racing. Nearest airport, he said, flipping switches with precision. We're gliding now. Let's make it count. Elena's fingers flew across the radio controls. Mayday, Mayday! This is Flight 19, she called, her voice a mix of urgency and calm professionalism. We've lost both engines and radar. Immediate assistance required. The storm outside added to the chaos, lightning illuminating the cockpit for fleeting moments as thunder rattled the fuselage. Rain lashed against the windshield, reducing visibility to near zero. David adjusted the yoke, his voice firm. We're not done yet. Keep trying the restart cycle. Anything. The plane shuddered violently again, its descent relentless. The cockpit smelled of burning metal and hydraulic fluid, a cruel reminder of the systems failing around them. The clock was ticking, and every second felt like an eternity. Hold together, David muttered under his breath, his eyes scanning the flickering instruments. Just hold together. The cabin was a storm of its own, a chorus of panicked whispers, muffled sobs, and the occasional cry from a child. The plane jolted again, harder this time, sending loose belongings skittering across the floor. Overhead compartments rattled ominously, and the flickering cabin lights only added to the chaos. Sarah, the senior flight attendant, moved down the aisle with forced composure, her reassuring smile a fragile mask. She knelt beside a trembling elderly woman clutching her rosary. It's just turbulence, Sarah said softly, her voice calm despite the lump in her throat. We'll be fine. Behind her, Jake, the burly and pragmatic attendant, steadied himself against a seatback. Sarah, stop sugarcoating. They know something's wrong, he whispered. His stern eyes darted toward the cockpit door. We need to prep them. Now. Sarah exhaled sharply, her mind racing. She reached for the intercom, her hand trembling slightly. The plane shuddered again, drawing a collective gasp from the passengers. Ladies and gentlemen, her voice echoed through the cabin, calm but firm. We are experiencing technical difficulties and will be making an emergency landing. Please remain seated, fasten your seatbelts tightly, and listen carefully to the crew's instructions. A young boy cried out, clutching his mother's arm, while a businessman frantically scrolled through his phone, seeking a signal that wasn't there. The sense of helplessness was palpable. Jake moved to the emergency row, his voice steady as he briefed the passengers. When we land, you'll need to evacuate quickly. Leave everything behind. Focus on getting out safely. The cabin braced as the plane jolted again, the reality sinking in for everyone on board. They were fighting for their lives. The cockpit felt like a battleground, every alarm and warning light another enemy closing in. Hydraulics are failing, Elena said sharply, her voice cutting through the chaos. She gripped the console, the strain evident in her knuckles. Controls are stiffening. David wrestled with the yoke, the plane bucking against his every command. Sweat trickled down his temple, but his resolve remained unshaken. Manual override, he barked. We'll do this the hard way, old school flying. Outside, the storm unleashed its fury. Sheets of rain pounded the windshield, the wipers struggling to keep up. Lightning illuminated the clouds, casting eerie shadows across the cockpit. This storm is tearing us apart, Elena muttered, her eyes scanning the instruments. We're losing altitude too fast. David didn't look up. His focus was absolute. If we can't make the airport, find me flat terrain, he said. We'll glide in if we have to. Suddenly, the plane jolted violently, the groan of metal under immense stress reverberating through the cockpit. Structural integrity is compromised, Elena shouted, gripping her seat as the plane shuddered again. David's jaw tightened. We've got to hold her together. I need those instruments, Elena. Elena's hands flew over the controls, her voice steady despite the chaos. Electrical failure in secondary systems. We're losing cabin pressure. Lights, everything. The dashboard flickered erratically, casting the cockpit in a dim, ominous glow. The sound of air escaping through a compromised seal was faint but unmistakable. Elena turned to David, her expression a mix of determination and fear. We're flying blind. No radar, no guidance. It's all on us now. David nodded, his grip on the yoke unrelenting. Then we make every second count. The storm outside roared louder, the plane buffeted by unrelenting turbulence. Despite the chaos, the two pilots worked as one. Their training and instincts their only lifelines in a situation spiraling out of control. The cabin tilted sharply, throwing passengers against their seatbelts. A cacophony of screams filled the air, fear rippling through the plane like electricity. Sarah steadied herself against a seat back, her calm demeanor masking the storm of anxiety brewing inside. "Maya, stay with me," Sarah urged, her voice slicing through the panic. "We have a job to do." Maya, gripping the seat for balance, nodded with trembling resolve. Her face was pale, but she forced herself to move, demonstrating the brace position to the terrified passengers. "Lean forward, hands over your head. Stay down," she repeated, her voice growing stronger with each instruction. Nearby, Jake crouched beside an elderly man who was struggling to fasten his seatbelt. "Got you," he muttered, his movements swift and precise despite the chaos. He glanced at Sarah. "We're running out of time." Sarah met his eyes for a fleeting moment, her expression a mix of urgency and determination. "We'll hold them together, Jake. Just keep going." In the cockpit, the tension was equally palpable. Elena's fingers flew over the failing control panel, fighting to extract every last ounce of functionality. "We're down to emergency power," she reported, her voice cracking under the weight of the situation. "Comms are about to drop. This is it." David's response was steady, his presence anchoring the chaos around them. "Get our coordinates out now. Let ATC know our intentions before we lose them completely." Elena toggled the radio, her voice cutting through the static. "Mayday, Mayday, Flight 19, coordinates are..." The radio hissed, then went silent. David exhaled sharply, gripping the yoke as the plane jolted again. "It's all on us now," he murmured, his eyes scanning the storm outside. In the cabin, Sarah looked down the aisle at her team and the frightened passengers. The weight of their lives pressed on her shoulders, but she stood tall. "We've got this," she whispered, her voice carrying more strength than she felt. The storm outside roared with fury, lightning illuminating the cockpit in erratic bursts. Each flash revealed the tension etched on David and Elena's faces. "We're losing altitude too fast," Elena said, her voice steady but urgent. She pointed to the altimeter, its needle plummeting. "At this rate, we'll hit the ground in 5 minutes." David's grip on the yoke tightened, his knuckles white. "Flaps in gear. Deploy them. We'll use drag to slow our descent." Elena hesitated for a fraction of a second. "That'll cut our glide range." "If we don't, we're out of time anyway," David countered. He glanced at her, their eyes locking for a brief moment of silent agreement. Elena flipped the switches, and the sound of hydraulic systems groaning under strain filled the cockpit. The plane shuddered violently, but the descent began to steady, just barely. In the cabin, chaos reigned. The plane's abrupt lurch knocked loose overhead baggage, sending it crashing into the aisles. Sarah grabbed the intercom, her voice slicing through the cacophony. "Brace! Heads down! Stay down!" she commanded, her tone firm and unyielding. Passengers bent forward, their faces pressed into their knees. Some clung to each other, their whispered prayers nearly drowned out by the deafening roar of the storm and the unsettling groan of the aircraft under stress. Jake darted between rows, locking stray seatbelts and shouting reassurances. "Stay down! We're almost through this!" He met Sarah's eyes briefly, both of them silently acknowledging the gravity of the moment. In the cockpit, a new alarm blared, piercing the already chaotic soundscape. "Terrain warning," Elena said, her voice now tinged with fear. "We've got high ground ahead and less than 2 minutes to react." David's mind raced, calculating every possible outcome. He squinted at the storm-shrouded horizon, desperately searching for a way out. "We're putting this bird down," he muttered through gritted teeth, his jaw set, his focus sharpened. One way or another. The cockpit crackled with tension, the storm outside roaring as if it could sense the chaos within. David gripped the yoke, his knuckles white. The radar screen flickered uselessly, its static offering no guidance. "We're out of options," David said, his voice clipped. "Nearest airport is beyond our range. We have to ditch, now." Elena's hand froze over the control panel. "Ditch? Over the ocean? In this storm?" Her voice wavered despite her best efforts to stay composed. David met her gaze, his own steady. It's the only chance we have. Solid ground means certain death. Water gives us a shot. Elena inhaled sharply, her lips pressed into a thin line. A shot, she repeated almost to herself. Unless you've got a better plan, David added, his tone hardening. Elena exhaled and shook her head. Fine. Prepping the systems. She flipped a series of switches, the cockpit lights dimming slightly as non-essential systems powered down. Hydraulics to manual, engines at minimum thrust. David toggled the intercom, his voice calm but firm. Mayday, Mayday, this is Flight 19. We're executing an emergency water landing. Last known position coordinates transmitted. All passengers and crew, brace for impact. The words hung in the air like a death knell. Elena glanced at him. You make it sound so easy, she said, her voice tight. David allowed himself a grim smile. Would you prefer I panic? The plane jolted violently as turbulence clawed at its battered frame. Elena's hands trembled as she keyed in the final commands. Flaps set, cabin secured, she reported. Her voice had steadied, though her eyes betrayed the storm raging inside her. David took a deep breath, his hands firm on the yoke. Here we go, ready or not. The storm outside howled its fury, but inside the cockpit, there was only silence as they prepared to face the impossible. The cabin was a storm of its own. Screams, prayers, and the panicked cries of children filled the narrow space as the plane shuddered violently. Sarah gripped the seatbacks for balance, her voice sharp and commanding. Heads down! Brace position now! She yelled, moving swiftly down the aisle. Her tone left no room for argument. Jake was at the rear, his hands steady despite the chaos. He knelt beside an elderly man whose hands shook as he fumbled with his seatbelt. Here, let me, Jake said, his voice low and reassuring as he tightened the belt. We've got this. Just listen to Sarah, okay? The man nodded weakly, his eyes wide with fear. Jake patted his shoulder. Good, stay like that, and don't move until we tell you. Sarah reached a young mother clutching her toddler. Ma'am, the child needs to be in the brace position too, she said firmly, but her eyes softened as she added, You can do this. Hold them tight. The woman nodded, her face streaked with tears, and adjusted her grip on the child. Sarah paused, glancing out the small window. A crack of lightning lit up the churning ocean below, its waves gleaming menacingly in the storm's fury. Her throat tightened. Jake, she called softly, her voice wavering for the first time. Jake turned, his jaw set. We're going to make it. No if. Just keep moving. His words were firm, but his eyes mirrored the weight they were both carrying. The plane lurched violently, throwing Sarah against the seats. A loud crack reverberated through the cabin, followed by the sound of strained metal. Sarah scrambled to her feet, grabbed the intercom, and shouted above the chaos. Brace! Hold tight, everyone! The cabin fell into a tense, trembling silence, broken only by the sound of the storm and the collective breath of those waiting for the unknown. The cockpit was a maelstrom of chaos. Warning alarms blared in every direction, each one a siren screaming doom. Altitude critical, terrain critical. David's voice cut through the noise, unnervingly steady. Flaps full. Elena's hands flew across the controls, her breath shallow but focused. Flaps deployed, she confirmed, her voice cracking under the strain. Beads of sweat trickled down her temple, but her grip on the throttle remained firm. The plane jolted as if the storm itself had grabbed hold of it, tossing it mercilessly. A deafening crack rang out as the left wing dipped dangerously, forcing David to yank the yoke hard to the right. We're coming in too fast, Elena shouted, her eyes darting between the altimeter and the surging ocean below. David's knuckles whitened on the yoke. I know, but we don't have a choice. His voice dropped lower, almost to himself. Come on, baby, hold together. Lightning exploded outside the windshield, illuminating the angry waves below. The ocean looked like a beast waiting to devour them, its surface churning with violent intent. Elena's voice was sharp. Angle, David. Pull it up, now. I've got it, David snapped, though the strain in his voice betrayed him. His hands trembled as he adjusted the pitch, fighting against the relentless pull of gravity and the storm's fury. The altimeter's needle plunged closer to zero. The cockpit rattled violently, loose panels vibrating against their frames. "Brace for impact," David roared into the intercom, his voice carrying the weight of desperation and command. Elena's hands hovered over the controls, ready to react even as the ocean seemed to rise up to meet them. David's gaze locked on the horizon for a split second, his jaw tightening. "Here we go. Impact in 3, 2. The cockpit filled with the roar of rushing wind and the deafening crash of water as the plane hurtled toward its fate. The plane slammed into the ocean with a bone-jarring force, the sound of tearing metal and rushing water echoing like a thunderclap. The impact launched passengers against their restraints, and everything not bolted down became airborne. Luggage, trays, loose safety cards. In the cabin, Sarah clung to a seat back as the world seemed to tilt sideways. Overhead compartments burst open, spilling belongings like a chaotic rain. The cabin lights flickered and died, plunging everything into a dim, eerie glow. "Stay down! Heads down!" Sarah bellowed, her voice cutting through the cacophony of screams and the roaring water. Jake, further down the aisle, was already at work, pulling debris off a trapped passenger. "You're okay, I've got you," he said, though his own voice betrayed his fear. The cockpit was no better. David and Elena were slammed forward, their harnesses biting into their shoulders. For a moment, there was only the sound of labored breathing and the eerie creaking of the fuselage. David groaned, his vision swimming. "Elena, status?" His voice was hoarse, his ribs aching with every word. Elena coughed, tasting salt and blood. Her hands flew over the controls out of instinct, though many were now useless. "Engines are gone, electricals fried, but..." She paused, glancing at the instruments. "We're floating." David exhaled, the faintest glimmer of relief crossing his face. "Good, good." He pressed the intercom, though it crackled with static. "Evacuate, now." In the cabin, water began seeping in around the doors. Sarah grabbed a flashlight, motioning to Jake. "Time to go. Open the slides." Passengers huddled together, their faces pale with shock as the crew worked to organize the evacuation. Outside, the storm continued to rage, waves crashing against the fuselage like nature wasn't done with them yet. The cold seawater crept higher, pooling around passengers' ankles as the cabin tilted at a precarious angle. Panic threatened to take over, but Sarah's voice cut through the chaos like a lifeline. "Everyone, life vests on! Move quickly, but stay calm!" she shouted, her voice hoarse but resolute. Jake was already at the emergency exit, wrestling with the handle. The door groaned, then burst open with a rush of wind and rain. He pulled the slide release, and with a loud hiss, the inflatable raft unfurled into the stormy darkness. "Go, go, go!" Jake urged, reaching out to steady a mother clutching her young child. The woman hesitated, her wide eyes darting from the open exit to the turbulent waves. "You'll be fine," Jake said firmly, his hands guiding her onto the raft. "We've got you." In the cockpit, David and Elena worked to ensure every system was shut down to prevent further catastrophe. David turned to Elena, his face pale but determined. "You good?" Elena nodded, her hands trembling as she unbuckled her harness. "Let's finish this." The two emerged into the cabin, now a chaotic scene of passengers scrambling for safety. Sarah spotted them immediately. "We've got most of them out," she reported, her hair plastered to her face with rain and sweat. "But the water's coming in fast." "Keep moving," David ordered, his gaze scanning the cabin. "Everyone off this plane." The storm outside was merciless, the wind howling like a feral beast. Waves battered the fuselage, but the rafts bobbed resiliently in the chaos. Elena grabbed Sarah's arm as they neared the exit. "You first," she said, her voice firm. Sarah hesitated, looking back at the cabin filled with terrified faces. "Not until the last passenger is out." David's voice broke through the tension. "We don't have time for debates. Move!" As they stepped onto the raft, the freezing spray of the ocean hit them like a slap. The storm raged on, but for the first time, there was a glimmer of hope. Survival wasn't guaranteed, but together they had a fighting chance. The storm had finally receded, leaving behind an eerie stillness. The rafts bobbed on the dark ocean, illuminated only by the dim glow of emergency lights and distant lightning flashes. Shivering passengers huddled together, clutching each other for warmth and reassurance. David sat at the edge of one of the rafts, his hands trembling as he gripped the soaked fabric. His mind raced with fragments of the night, alarms blaring, the ocean rising to meet them, Elena's panicked shouts. "We made it," Elena said softly beside him, her voice raw. Her hair was matted to her face, and her eyes glistened with exhaustion. David didn't look at her. Barely. On the other raft, Sarah moved from passenger to passenger, checking for injuries and offering faint smiles. Her voice, which had carried so much authority during the crisis, now wavered as she murmured reassurances. Jake handed out the last of the emergency blankets, his jaw tight. "Rescue's on the way," he said, though the strain in his voice betrayed his doubt. The faint sound of approaching helicopters broke through the silence, a beacon of hope. As the searchlights swept across the waves, cheers erupted from the passengers. "We're here!" someone shouted, their voice cracking with relief. David finally exhaled, his grip loosening on the raft. "We did it," he whispered, though his words carried the weight of everything they had endured. The helicopters roared, their lights cutting through the darkness. Ocean spray hit Sarah's face as rescuers dove in, shouting over the storm. "Life vests on! Follow them!" Sarah yelled, helping an elderly woman. "You're next, ma'am. Hold tight." The woman's hands trembled. "Thank you," she whispered. Jake waded through the water, holding a crying child. "You're going to be okay," he said, pausing near Sarah. "You holding up?" "Just focus on getting them out," Sarah replied, barely standing. Passengers were hoisted up, each rescue a small victory. The weight of the night lingered. David and Elena watched from a raft, the wreckage looming behind them. "We were supposed to keep them safe," Elena said. David's jaw tightened. "They're alive because of us." A rescuer motioned. "Your turn." David hesitated, staring at the wreckage. Elena touched his arm. "We have to go." He nodded, and they climbed into the harness, the icy spray biting as the helicopter lifted them. The wreckage shrank below, but the weight of the night stayed with them. The shoreline was a blur of flashing lights, cameras, and shouting. As the rescue helicopter landed, reporters swarmed, firing questions. "Captain, how did you land in those conditions?" one journalist yelled, microphone thrust forward. David stepped onto solid ground, still shaken. "We did our job," he said, his voice tired. Elena, her hair wet and face set, added, "It wasn't just us. Teamwork saved those lives." Questions flooded in. "Were you afraid?" Jake, a few steps away, answered, "Fear doesn't save lives. Action does." Sarah, pale and tear-streaked, said quietly, "Our focus was the passengers. That's what mattered." Flashes captured the exhaustion and unity of the crew. As the questions continued, rescue personnel ushered them toward ambulances. "What's next?" reporters called. Sarah glanced back, murmuring, "We survived. That's enough for now." The ambulance doors closed, and silence replaced the chaos, broken only by the distant storm. The crew exchanged tired glances, a mix of relief and the weight of their ordeal. In the days after, the crew faced intense scrutiny. Investigators combed through the wreckage, seeking answers. David, under the harsh lights of a conference room, was asked, "Was it the right call, Captain?" He replied, "It wasn't the best, but it was the only one we had." Elena added, "We made choices to save lives. That's what matters." In counseling, Sarah said, "It's not about being a hero. It's holding it together when everything's falling apart." Jake nodded. "Fear pushes you forward. You just hope it's enough." Days later, reunited, the crew sat silently, a bond stronger than before. Elena raised a glass. "To survival." David looked around, his voice steady. "We did what we had to. Now, we move forward." They had faced the impossible together, and in that, they found hope.